Carrick Highway, a black ribbon across the green hills, winding, twisting, dangerous. People said it was haunted. They whispered about accidents, about disappearances, about ghosts. The sun dipped below the hills. Shadows grew long and dark. The air turned cold. A lone car sped down the empty highway. Two headlights cut through the growing darkness. The driver was alone, or so he thought. The old ones spoke of a curse, a shaman's dying breath, anger at the road's construction. They said he cursed the land, cursed the machines, cursed the people who built the road. Many died during its construction. Accidents, strange illnesses, suicides. The whispers started soon after. Stories of strange lights, ghostly figures, and a yellow Volkswagen. The driver saw it in his rearview mirror, a pale yellow Volkswagen, round headlights like eyes, following close. He pressed down on the gas pedal. The engine roared, but the yellow Volkswagen stayed close. Faster and faster he drove. The needle on the speedometer trembled. Still, the yellow Volkswagen followed. He could see the driver now, a shadowy figure, face obscured by darkness. The driver slowed down. He needed help, someone to see, to confirm he wasn't going crazy. A figure stood by the road, a young woman. She was waving, asking for a ride. He hesitated, but the fear of being alone was stronger. He pulled over. The woman got in. She didn't speak, just stared ahead. Her eyes were empty sockets. She had no face. The driver slammed on the brakes. He jumped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman was gone, vanished. He was alone again, more alone than ever. He looked around. The highway was gone. He was on a narrow dirt road surrounded by dense forest. The sun was gone. The moon hid behind thick clouds. He was lost, and the night was alive with whispers. He locked the car doors. He curled up in the back seat, too scared to sleep. The forest was alive. He heard whispers, rustling leaves, branches tapping on the car windows. He saw shadows moving in the trees, eyes glinting in the darkness. Something was out there, watching. He stayed awake all night, terror his only companion. The yellow Volkswagen never returned. When the sun finally rose, he drove. He didn't know where he was going, just away from the forest. He came to a sharp bend in the road. A mangled wreck lay at the bottom of a steep embankment. It was a yellow Volkswagen, crushed almost beyond recognition. An old wreck. He could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. A skeletal hand still gripped the wheel. He ran to the wreck. He had to help. Maybe someone was alive. The night was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, making the scene even more surreal. He could see the twisted metal of the car, its headlights flickering weakly. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the air, a stark reminder of the violence of the crash. He had to move quickly. Every second counted. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he approached the wreckage, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might find. Would there be survivors? Was anyone trapped inside waiting for help? He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to act. He looked inside the car. The driver was gone. Only the skeleton remained. The sight was both shocking and confusing. How long had the car been here? The skeleton was a grim reminder of mortality, its empty eye sockets staring back at him. The interior of the car was a mess, with broken glass and debris scattered everywhere. The seats were torn, and the dashboard was cracked. It was as if the car had been abandoned for years, yet the accident seemed so recent. He couldn't understand how the skeleton had decomposed so quickly. It didn't make sense. He felt a chill run down his spine as he tried to piece together the mystery. The car's radio was still playing a faint, static-filled tune, adding to the eerie atmosphere. He felt a sense of dread wash over him, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to find out what had happened. But the inside of the car was covered in fresh blood. The contrast between the skeleton and the fresh blood was jarring. It was as if time had played a cruel trick, mixing the past and the present in a macabre tableau. The blood was everywhere, splattered on the seats, the dashboard, and the windows. It was still wet, glistening in the moonlight. He could almost smell the metallic tang of it, mingling with the other scents of the night. The sight made his stomach churn. but he forced himself to stay focused. There had to be an explanation for this. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the blood, but pulled back at the last moment. He didn't want to contaminate the scene. He needed to think clearly, to figure out what had happened here. The blood told a story, but he couldn't decipher it yet. He needed more clues. He stumbled back in horror. The realization of what he was seeing hit him like a physical blow. His mind raced with questions and fears. What kind of accident could leave such a scene? Was there something more sinister at play? He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, and he had to fight to keep his balance. The world seemed to spin around him, the shadows closing in. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He had to stay focused, to find answers. But the horror of the scene was overwhelming. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, and his hands were shaking. He took a step back, trying to distance himself from the nightmare in front of him. But he couldn't escape the images that were now burned into his mind. He had to keep going, to find out the truth. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, covered in sweat. He could see the faint outline of his veins, pulsing with adrenaline. He clenched his fists, trying to stop the shaking. But then he noticed something else. His hands were covered in blood. Fresh, wet blood. He hadn't touched anything, yet his hands were stained red. He felt a surge of panic. How was this possible? He looked around, trying to find an explanation, but there was nothing. Just the wrecked car and the silent night. He felt a chill run down his spine. Was he losing his mind? He wiped his hands on his pants, but the blood wouldn't come off. It seemed to cling to his skin, a constant reminder of the horror he had witnessed. He had to find out what was going on. He couldn't leave until he had answers. They were covered in blood. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He hadn't touched the car, yet his hands were stained with blood. It didn't make sense. He felt a wave of fear wash over him. Was he somehow connected to this accident? Had he been here before, without realizing it? He tried to remember, but his mind was a blur. He felt a sense of dread growing inside him. He had to find out the truth. He couldn't leave until he knew what had happened. He looked around, trying to find any clues that might help him. But the night was silent, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. He felt a sense of urgency. He had to act quickly before it was too late. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to stay focused. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He hadn't touched the car. The thought echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the mystery he was facing. He looked at his hands again, trying to make sense of it. The blood was still wet, glistening in the moonlight. He felt a sense of disbelief. How could this be happening? He hadn't touched the car, yet his hands were covered in blood. He felt a surge of frustration. He had to find out what was going on. He couldn't leave until he had answers. He looked around, trying to find any clues that might help him. But the night was silent, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. He felt a sense of urgency. He had to act quickly before it was too late. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to stay focused. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He heard a noise behind him, a soft, rasping breath. He turned slowly. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. The night was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. He felt a sense of dread wash over him. What was behind him? He turned slowly, trying to keep his movements steady. He didn't want to startle whatever was there. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The noise was getting closer, a soft, rasping breath. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. He could see a shadowy figure just out of reach. It was moving slowly, almost as if it was stalking him. He felt a surge of fear. What was it? He took a step back, trying to put some distance between himself and the figure. But it kept coming, its breath growing louder. He felt a sense of panic. He had to get away. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the figure behind him, its breath growing louder. He didn't look back. He just kept running, hoping to escape the nightmare that was closing in around him. A figure stood behind him, a young woman, covered in blood. Her eyes were empty sockets. She reached out to him, her hand dripping with blood. She spoke, her voice a dry, rattling whisper. "Help me," she pleaded. Her touch sent a jolt of icy terror through him. He understood. He wasn't covered in the blood of the dead driver. He was covered in hers. He was trapped, just like the others, forever bound to the highway. A new ghost for the Carrack Terror, the sunset. the shadows returned. The yellow Volkswagen was gone, but the woman remained. She stood on the side of the road, waving, waiting for the next lost soul to pick her up.